Alright, let's move on to our next major group of the invertebrates. We are done with the Lophotrichozoa. My goodness, Lophotrichozoa. I'm glad we're done with that one because I cannot pronounce that one at all, as if I can pronounce all the rest of them equally as well. Ecdysozoa. We're on to the Ecdysozoa, and we're going to find that those would include the arthropods, which would be our insects and crustaceans. They have a hard outer covering that has to be shed every so often. And so let's look at this next group, the Ecdysozoa. Concept 33.4 says ecdysozoans are the most species-rich animal group. Ecdysozoans are covered by a tough coating called a cuticle, and that cuticle is going to be made up of chitin. The cuticle is shed or molted through a process called ecdysis. The two largest phyla that we're going to look at are nematodes and arthropods. We're going to focus on the arthropods because that includes the insects and crustaceans, the ones that you're probably most familiar with. So here we are, the ecdysozoa right here, the ones that have a shell that has to be molted or shed. Nematodes will be the first ones we look at just briefly. Nematodes or roundworms are found in most aquatic habitats, including in moist soils. Some of them are specific to particular hosts. They are parasitic, so they can be found in moist tissues of plants and in the body fluids and tissues of certain animals. They have a digestive tract and alimentary canal, but they lack a circulatory system, and reproduction of nematodes is usually sexual by internal fertilization. So they're a little bit more complex in their sexual reproduction, but they don't have a circulatory system like some of the more complex creatures we're going to look at later on. So we have some pictures of nematodes, I believe, if you look inside the Chapter 33 folder, a video or two. Some of these nematodes, C. elegans is a nematode that is one that has been studied over and over in biology. It's a model organism in research and it's often used in various biological studies. And then some species of nematodes are important because they are parasites of plants and animals. This particular one, Trichinella, can be acquired by humans from undercooked pork. So it can be infected in pigs and then passed on to humans by eating pig meat, pork that hasn't been fully cooked. So here you see the juveniles of the parasitic nematode Trichinella encysted in muscle tissue. So this is human muscle tissue, and then you see some encysted juveniles of this nematode inside the human tissue. So basically you would have these juvenile nematode worms that grow and then come out of your muscle tissue, which would not be a very pleasant thing to happen. So some of these nematodes, most of them are living in water or soil, but some of them are also parasitic, living in other creatures. Let's move on to the arthropods, where we're going to spend a little bit more time. Arthropods are going to be your insects and crustaceans. 2 out of every 3 known species of animals is an arthropod, so they outnumber everyone else. There is a tremendous number and variety of arthropods. Members of this phylum Arthropoda are found in nearly all habitats of the biosphere, and they outnumber all other animals combined. So if you looked at all other animals combined, they wouldn't be as many as there are arthropods. Let's look briefly at their origin. The arthropod body plan consists of segmented body, hard exoskeleton, jointed appendages. This body plan dates way back to the Cambrian explosion, first seen about 500 million years ago, and early arthropods showed very little variation from segment to segment. So here's a trilobite, which is a very well-known fossilized example. So you see all of these segments, but you'll notice that all of these segments tend to be very alike. They have this big head segment, but then they have all these body segments that are very alike, and there's not a lot of differentiation. As we go further in the evolution of these arthropods, we start to see further and further development of different segments. Arthropod evolution is characterized by a decrease in the number of segments and an increase in appendage specialization. These changes may have been caused by changes in those Hox control genes that we have mentioned previously. Some general characteristics of arthropods: the appendages of some living arthropods have been vastly modified for functions such as walking, feeding, sensory reception, reproduction, defense. So while they have more numerous different kinds of appendages, they have become very specialized. You'll see a wide variety. They tend to be similar in that they're all jointed, segmented, and they also come in pairs. So a good example would be lobsters. If you look at a lobster, he has a number of different sorts of appendages. So some of these appendages are like the claws, which are used for defense. Some of these appendages are like antennae, which are used as sensory reception. Some of these appendages are mouth parts. Some of them are walking legs. Some of them are swimming appendages. So he has all variety of different appendages, and they are heavily modified for different purposes. You'll also notice that he is divided into segments. He has a cephalothorax. In some cases it's all one piece, but in other cases it's divided into a head and a thorax and then a third abdomen. The body of an arthropod is completely covered by a cuticle. It's an exoskeleton made of layers of protein and the polysaccharide chitin, and so it encloses this creature and cannot grow with him. So when the arthropod grows, every so often it has to molt and shed its exoskeleton, which is something you've probably commonly seen with different insects and the like the little locust here. Arthropods have eyes, olfactory receptors, antennae that function in touch and smell. They have a basic, what's called an open circulatory system, in which a material similar to blood called hemolymph is circulated into the spaces surrounding the tissues and organs. So they don't have a vascular system of arteries and veins, but they do have kind of what's called an open circulatory system where the blood material flows in through the body cavity. They have a variety of organs specialized for gas exchange, some basic similar to functioning lungs, so they're much more complex than some of the creatures we've looked at thus far. Genetic and molecular evidence suggests that the living arthropods that we have around us today consist of 4 major lineages that diverged early on in the phylum's evolution. We have the Chelicerates. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that one right. I'll have to check on that. That would include sea spiders, horseshoe crabs, scorpions, ticks, mites, and spiders. And then we have the myriapods, centipedes and millipedes, hexapods, which would be your true insects and their various relatives, and the crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, barnacles, and many others. So we'll take a brief look at these 4 categories and look at some of the examples. I just looked it up, and as expected, this is not a CH sound, it's a K sound, so this will be chelicerates. So oftentimes the CH in some of these pronunciations is a K, a hard K, and that's the case here. So chelicerates. Chelicerates, myriapods, hexapods, and crustaceans. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at the chelicerates, and then we'll take a short break before we move on to the others as well. So the chelicerates are named for their claw-like feeding appendages called chelicera, and the earliest chelicera forms were eupratids, water scorpions. Most marine chelicera forms are extinct, but there are a few surviving members. So we don't have many of these guys around anymore, but the most commonly known one is the horseshoe crab, which they look pretty ancient. I mean, if you look at them, they look like a living fossil. So these chelicerates, they have certain feeding appendages that kind of make them unique, and you can see they have a kind of a segmented body plan as well. Most modern chelicera forms are arachnids, which would include spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. So although we don't have a lot of the marine chelicera forms, the water-dwelling chelicera forms around anymore, except for the horseshoe crabs, there are quite a few of the chelicerates that live on the land, the chelicera forms. So arachnids such as spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites are a good example of all of these. Arachnids have an abdomen, which would be the rear portion of their body, and a cephalothorax, which is a combined middle and head portion. They have 6 pairs of appendages. The chelicera, which are, remember, the claw-like feeding appendages, the pedipalps, and then 4 pairs of walking legs. Gas exchange in spiders occurs in a simple sort of respiratory system, a respiratory organ called book lungs. And of course we know that many spiders produce silk, which is a type of liquid protein that comes initially from their body as a liquid, but then becomes a solid as it is exposed to the air. And that's formed in specialized abdominal glands. So here's a look at a spider. Here's this chelicera, which oftentimes can be delivered different versions of venom or poison. So this chelicera can kind of form little fangs. Then he has pedipalps as well, and then he has the 4 sets of walking legs. a basic circulatory system, intestines. They have a very simple form of a lung called a book lung, and then some of the basic body things that you might see in more advanced creatures as well. The next subphylum would be the Myriapoda. The Myriapoda include the millipedes and centipedes, and then we'll take a break after this one. The millipedes and centipedes, Myriapoda, are terrestrial, and they have jaw-like mandibles. They can look pretty scary. They have fairly large jaw-like structures that can look a little bit frightening. Millipedes eat decaying leaves and plant matter, and millipedes have many legs with 2 pairs per trunk segment. And although the name millipede would tell you they have 1,000 legs, they generally do not. They generally have anywhere between, say, 100 to 300. So here's a millipede. He may have 100, 200 legs depending on the type, and they have some fairly large mandibles, and they have a pair of legs per body segment. The other version of this would be a centipede. Centipede right there. There's a millipede. Centipedes are carnivores, and centipedes have 1 pair of legs per trunk segment. So here's a centipede, usually has fewer legs. Centipedes, oftentimes, some of them are venomous, and you would want to not be bitten by them. So if you were going to pick up or play with a millipede or centipede, it would generally be the centipede that you would want to avoid. The millipede is generally harmless. Before we move on to the hexapoda, which would be the insects, let's take a quick break, because the insects, of course, is a fairly large category, one we're familiar with. So let's stop right there. We'll come right back.